My name is Valerie Kennington. I'm 70 years old.
My name is Samuel Singley, and I'm 66 years old.
I was in high school when I first heard of Martin Luther King, probably late, maybe a senior.
15, 16 years old, was in high school.
I was aware of his ministry. I was not very much aware of his ideas and his philosophies because we did not have an opportunity to see a whole speech. We only got sound bites on the news. So I knew that there were marches, I knew that there were demonstrations. I did not know that he was for peaceful change or peaceful demonstrations because there was so much conflict and so much rage and so much violence with the Vietnam War going on and the demonstrations. So I may have clumped him in with that a little bit.
I thought of him as a peaceful person. I knew that some of the things that he was doing were causing some riots, some upheaval in the South. But after completely understanding what he was about, my opinion was he was a very peaceful person. Matter of fact, after I found out a little bit more about him, I realized he fashioned his movement after Gandhi, which was a nonviolent way to change the world. So he was definitely a peaceful person.
After he was assassinated, I remember becoming more aware of his beliefs.
Yeah. And where did you live at the time?
I lived in San Luis Obispo, California.
Would you say that at the time the newspapers were for or against Martin Luther King Jr.?
I don't remember reading newspapers. It was always in our home. I knew it was something that my parents did daily, but it was not something as a teenager I was really interested in.
I think as far as politics is concerned, I never knew how my parents looked at it from a political perspective. I really didn't know whether we were Democrat or Republican because I didn't really follow politics at that time. I know that my parents thought he was a great man in the sense of, in our community, some of the most revered people were the pastors in the black churches. So Martin Luther King, being a pastor of a church, gave him a certain amount of respect in my household. And the odd thing is that he preached in Birmingham, Alabama, and I was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which is about 15, 20 minutes away from Birmingham. And one of the reasons actually that my family came to California was because my aunts and uncles and father and mother wanted to get us as kids out of that situation in the South.
At that time, how important was politics to you?
It probably was not high on my list of priorities. My family was politically minded. My parents, I remember, had very definite and strong views on politics and on things that were going on in the world. I was raised in an extremely patriotic home. But as far as the information coming into my life, it was more on the periphery. There was an ambiance of it around our house, more than actual deep discussions.
Yeah, so your family has a little bit of, has gone through a bit of segregation, would you say? Have they experienced what it was like? And do you have any stories that would help us really relate to what was going on at that time?
I think so. A couple of stories actually. When I was after coming to California with my parents and everything, I had an opportunity, they took us back to see our grandparents and everything. And being raised in California, I was about 7 or 8 years old. Being raised in California, things were different here. So when we got to Alabama, I'll never forget it because we were going to go to the store with my uncles and other family members, and we had to walk about a mile through the woods in order to get to this little country store. So we did that, and we got to the store, and everybody was picking out what they wanted, what candy they wanted and everything. And I picked out my candy, and I walked up to the counter and was getting ready to pay for it. The looks I got were horrendous. People were shocked, and my relatives had to tell me, I said, no, you don't go up to the counter until all the white people have paid for their stuff, and then if there's nobody there, then you can go up. You don't just go up to the counter. And it was odd for me because it wasn't like that in California. And naturally seeing black, white water fountains, that sort of thing. And just little things in the South that we took for granted here in California. You had to understand the social norms back in the South so you wouldn't get into trouble. And in the South then, I didn't realize it myself until I was told later, in the South then, trouble just didn't mean somebody was going to say, don't do that. Trouble could mean you would get killed for making the wrong move socially.
How have your views towards Martin changed?
When I first became aware of him, as I said, I was aware of his ministry. I suppose had I given it more thought, I would have realized that as a preacher, he may have been preaching more of a peaceful resolution to problems. But growing up in California, I did not grow up around racism at all. We were trained very early on. My grandmother lived in a very, I won't say rough, but she lived in downtown Long Beach, and there were a lot of African Americans in her neighborhood. But I never saw any kind of racism. The only racism I ever heard about was outside of my home, and it was very little then. And I know it was shocking, surprising, when I would hear that someone's parents were racist at all, because it just, being in California, it wasn't quite the same as it was in the South. In 1973, I believe, after I was married, we moved to Houston, and that was the first time I became really aware of racism. And even then, it wasn't in the people my age, but they would tell me stories of their parents. And I did see it evidenced in some of the older people that I knew.
What was the political standing of the newspapers at that time? What was the political standing of your entire town on segregation?
You know, the odd thing is, being raised in Salinas, I really don't know during that time period, because I really didn't follow politics that much. And the only time I really read the newspapers or listened to the news, because we only had two TV channels back then. So if the news came on, you try to turn to something else like Bonanza or something, But the only time I ever really paid attention to the newspapers was if my picture was in the paper, because I played basketball for the local high school. So if I knew that was going to be it, I'd read the newspaper. But a lot of that stuff, it really didn't start kind of centering on me or settling on me until much later, like in seniors in high school, when I was a senior in high school, and then after. And that's when it really started to kind of sink in, what was really going on politically and all that kind of stuff.
Did you ever have any black friends at that time? Did you how many friends would you say you had that were black?
There were probably, I went to a small by today's standards, small high school. It was, I think there were 350 in my graduating class, which I guess is kind of medium. It didn't seem small. But in my high school class, there were probably 8 to 10 African Americans. And the African American boys were athletes, and they were very well thought of and treated very nicely. The girls, I was very good friends with a gal, Virginia Bell, and I saw her at my 25th reunion, and it was, I loved her. She was just great. We didn't hang out together, but we certainly enjoyed each other at school. I would have considered her one of my better friends.
What was your reaction to Martin Luther King Jr. finding out that he had been assassinated?
I'd have to say that my feeling on that was I figured it was going to happen. Most of my friends and most black people figured he was eventually going to get killed. Maybe a strange thing to say, but the conventional wisdom in the black community was this guy's doing something that is going to rile things up, and eventually he's going to get killed. Because that had been the history of a lot of civil rights and a lot of black people who had tried to make changes for us, even attempting to vote and things like that. You figured they're going to get killed. And believe it or not, a lot of, even to this day when Barack Obama was running for president, most black people thought that he would never make it to president, not because he wouldn't get the votes, but because someone would kill him. I know that sounds like a weird thing to say, but the history of race relations in this country is that if a black person made waves, they would be killed. It's just the way it was.
The world as a whole, or more precisely, the United States as a whole, was it more racist back then than it is today, or even less? What would you say? Which direction did it go?
Like I said, it was a little different in Houston than it was in California. And I was surprised to see racism anywhere. But I came to understand it a little bit more. I actually had friends whose parents fought in the Civil War, so it was still not very far removed. And I remember I went to a friend's house. She was older, she was probably my age now, and her housekeeper was there, and she was African American. And this was the most genteel Southern Belle type woman you've ever known. She was so lovely. But she bossed her housekeeper around with such harsh words, I couldn't believe it. And that was the only time really in my life that I had ever seen it, and I was absolutely shocked.
What did you feel when you heard what Martin Luther King Jr. was doing? If not at that time, when did it really strike you what was going on?
I think my first thought was when I started hearing a lot of his speeches and start understanding what was going on in the South, was pride. A lot of pride. Because when I was growing up, you hardly ever saw a black man standing up for his rights, because it was so difficult to do. And it was kind of weird because he started saying things that everybody would like to have said but couldn't say or were afraid to say. And here you have this educated, well-spoken, decent black guy saying these things. And there was a lot of turmoil going on at that time. It wasn't just Martin Luther King. It was Malcolm X. He was saying things that black people would normally get killed for it. He was killed for it also. There was, you had Muhammad Ali. That was when I was a 15, 16-year-old kid, that was an amazing thing. It was transforming to have a black man saying something like that. It was amazing. And a lot of people who didn't understand that, couldn't understand why this guy was so popular, Martin Luther King was so popular, why people revered him, is because of his courage, and we knew what kind of danger he was in for just saying the thing, saying we'd like to vote, we'd like to sit at the front of the bus.
We've come into a very strange time lately where you're not supposed to speak up. You're not supposed to disagree with certain people. I find that very, very hard to take, because as Martin Luther King always talked about, that was what was important, was what was in your heart. And I don't think he minded when there were disagreements on philosophy, as long as you treated people well. That seems to not be the case so much anymore. People are treated very ugly because they might disagree.
Martin Luther King was the sophisticated part of the movement. Malcolm X was the rough part of the movement. And James Brown and Muhammad Ali, in a way, were the kind of like a spiritual part of the movement. Because a statement like, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud," it seemed like a small statement, but it was transforming. It was, "I'm black and I'm proud," you didn't say that, but he did. So, very important. And Martin Luther King was the linchpin for all that stuff. He was the one everybody looked to set the tone, and he did it.